Once again, on December 6th, 2017, the company specializing in machine learning artificial intelligence known as DeepMind, founded in 2010, by the way, acquired by Google in 2014, took on the world's strongest chess engine, Stockfish, in a match. This is Game 5 from that match. If you have not seen our video review of Game 3, please click on the info and the related links in this video. Go ahead and check out Game 3 before you dive into Game 5. Once again, AlphaZero was white, and once again started with a, we'll say, human positional chess style approach, playing d4, not e4. And after e6, knight f3, we're actually on pace to get the same type of opening that we had in Game 3 in a Queen's Indian. So far, they're repeating exactly the moves from that game. Bishop to b7 chosen by Stockfish is different than the move bishop a6, queen to c2, which again, if you haven't seen Game 3 and the analysis, go ahead and click on the link and back up and do that. But we had bishop e7, which is a more traditional development by black in the Queen's Indian, here by Stockfish. And after bishop g2, bishop e7, Rekharovka. Castles again, we get the same type of positional pawn sack. Not the exact line. In the Game 3 analysis, d5 was played after black had extended the c5 pawn, creating a different type of positional dynamic where when the sacrifice happens on the d file, the d7 pawn is indeed backward, really struggling to advance. When white voluntarily pushes the d5 pawn, you're doing so to take advantage of the immediate pin possibilities, which happened right here after AlphaZero played the move knight h4. You're pinning the pawn on d5 to the bishop on b7, hoping to regain your pawn, and if black does nothing to prevent that, make a random move as an example. Now white has expanded in the center, will immediately support that space advantage with a move like e4, and black is frankly just positionally much, much worse. So in this line, playing the move c6 is really critical. It's what separates this type of gambit from, again, the analysis of Game 3 where the pawn was on c5 and can't move backwards. And it's really crucial for black to hold on to that d5 pawn, preventing, as I said, white from just regaining it and getting a huge space advantage. But after e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight f5, knight to c7, we are following theory as has been played again many times. It's always interesting to me when we see two engines play top theory as has been assessed as the best approach by the world's best human chess players, especially one like DeepMind that apparently has had no human influence outside of, as we've said, organic machine learning, which means it's played itself about 1.5 million times. That's probably even an under-exaggeration, and has come up with these approaches on its own. So that's really fascinating to know that this is exactly what he believed, he being AlphaZero, as the best line, even though he hasn't been fed opening theory. And speaking of opening theory, after e4, bishop f6, and now the move knight to d6, we have officially left opening theory. The only previous games in this line are some other moves, including knight c3, but the main other move in this line is the move rook to e1. Most notably, if you looked up this position in a database played by Grandmaster Tregubov, just a big name who played it recently, that game went after d5, e5, and white actually got a lot of compensation by eliminating the dark square bishop and then taking on g7. Tregubov went on to win that game, despite black having a material advantage, again, based similarly on kind of what we saw to Game 3, white having long-term compensation on the dark squares. But AlphaZero not interested in that, apparently, or believed that Stockfish might have an improvement, and decided to immediately put this pony on d6. A very direct approach, and in some ways you could argue humans didn't play this way because it seems a little overcommittal. There are very good chances this knight will end up being traded for somebody who's not this dark square bishop, which is what happened in the Tregubov line. And that's going to be less than ideal for white, or so we think, because you really want this knight to be traded off for the dark square bishop, because that makes your dark square bishop so much more powerful as it tries to anchor in on all of these positional weaknesses that white is getting for the sacrificed d5 pawn. But by putting the knight on d6 sort of, without a lot of mystery, that forces the line that we see here, played by Stockfish, and makes a lot of sense. Black is going to go out of his way to try to eliminate that knight and keep his dark square bishop. So in reviewing this game myself, I looked at the move knight to d6 as a surprising sort of deviation from the main approach, because I felt like if black, my human understanding, if black could trade that knight, as we said, for anybody but the dark square bishop, it certainly should be good for him. But That's where AlphaZero tricked me, in that in this position he was never intending on keeping the pawn advantage and taking here, which would be exactly what I said, a trade of a knight for the knight, letting black keep the dark square bishop, and all the things that I thought would not be ideal. Rather, AlphaZero had another idea in mind, which is that he was willing to go down 2 pawns, not just 1 pawn, but 2. So he takes f6, and after queen takes f6, yes, we have the kind of compensation that white believes could be super dangerous in this line. You have the dark square bishop without black having the counterpart. You have the d file. But black is down. Black is up 2 pawns here, and 2 pawns is a lot of pawns. I mean, I think that's the math. So after knight to c3, knight to b7, I was looking at this position and sort of surprised. And unlike my analysis of game 3, where I, despite Stockfish really getting squeezed and manhandled, or I guess deep mind-handled in the last video, again, check it out if you missed it, I never really criticized Stockfish as to having a better approach or something that was different. I was, AlphaZero just really seemed to outplay him from start to finish. But in this game, I'm going to do a little differently here. After knight e4 and queen to g6 and h4, yes, white is launching what seems to be the potential of a pawn storm. And yes, white has the dark square bishop that black does not. But being down 2 pawns and being in a structure where it seems that the only thing that makes sense is to try to use your 2-pawn advantage and expand them very quickly. The positional disaster that happened for black in game 3, again in a gambit in the Queen's Indian, was because the d-pawn was never able to move, and white gets the grip that is so devastating on the d-file as compensation. And that ends up being where we had here. And so my main question, and as anybody who analyzes this with Stockfish, at least the mortal engine that I have without a million jet engine CPUs, tells me, why isn't black playing the move d5? I don't know why Stockfish doesn't play d5. To me, it's the most principled thing to do. The best analysis I could come up with was that white was still going to launch the attack with h5, then g4, and now retreating the knight even to a move like g3. There is maybe also some other kind of weird sassiness there with moves like knight to g5. I tried to make some sort of crazy piece sacks like h6 work to try to undermine the f6 square, but I don't see why black isn't threatening to take the knight. So I looked at this position as, yes, still a decent amount of compensation for white. You have the dark square bishop that black doesn't, and h6 is still coming. But as my Stockfish engine here says, as you can see the evaluation bar, and to me, I look at this as just a principled thing that black needs to do. You have to try to expand and not let white get the grip. So I am obviously taking my life in my own hands as far as the commenters here on Twitch and YouTube, and everyone's going to let me have it. Who am I to criticize Stockfish? But from a principled perspective, to me, d5 has to be tried. Okay, but after h4, Stockfish doesn't agree with me. He plays h6. Here comes h5 with tempo. Note that now moves like queen f5 don't make nearly as much sense anyway. White's going to continue to launch the attack, and you haven't pushed the d-pawn. So the queen came back to h7, but here's where the gloves start to come off. And if you haven't grabbed the popcorn yet, you still have a chance to pause your video and see what went down. Queen to g4, awesomeness. The immediate threat is knight f6 check, winning on the spot. The immediate response that came to my mind is, why not f5? Well, there's actually several crazy lines. I want to show you one line that I analyzed personally because, hey, I'm doing the work here. I can show you some fun. After queen d1 takes e4, I was looking at a line like this that almost leads to some sort of strange smothered mate. And as crazy as this line is, the little pickle tickle here that the queen plays with the king to work her way into g6 actually leads to just some really, really weird positions where I wonder if white's compensation is, okay, black seems to really like Stockfish here, but at the very least, white would have a perpetual here. I know AlphaZero wants more than a draw. But to me, this position, again, highlights all the potential problems with this type of position. I thought it was a really interesting thing, and I simply ran out of time to keep trying to justify my crazy sack. But the best move after f5 is just the move queen to h4. This move, in similar fashion, highlights that the e4 knight is not takeable, because after takes, and queen to g6. Now it's a little more straightforward with the bishop coming into g6, and the threats are numerous and plentiful, if that's a word. Entry points on e7, entry points on e8. Again, we have a position where, have we ever seen Stockfish get his queen on such bad squares in back-to-back games, right? Again, referring to game 3. So that would have been a fascinating line. Stockfish doesn't play it and plays the move king h8. Seems to be the simplest way to deal with these problems of knight f6, and officially f5 has to be a threat now, right? And here's where AlphaZero really just played a brilliant move. No other way to describe it, so I won't. Bishop to g5. So much fun. What's the threat? Well, okay, after bishop g5, let's make a random move like d5, the move that would positionally make sense, and I've been sort of saying black should have tried for earlier. Here comes knight f6, and you see the problem. The knight is, of course, poisoned due to bishop takes f6 would be mate, and if the queen moves on c2, there were several lines here, but the prettiest one I picked to show you is the move bishop e4, exclam, d takes e4, and queen f5, exclamaviach, again, boomtown on h7, and there's nothing black can do to avoid the mate. So that would have been, again, a really fun way for this to end. Stockfish is calculating well. He is still the world's strongest chess engine as of all the dates previous to December 6, 2017. But so he plays f5, which is better to stop knight f6. But after queen f4, the f5 pawn is pinned, and we still have not solved our queenside development issues. So here, knight to c5 was played. I'm going to, again, because I said that I thought Stockfish should have played it earlier, I wanted to note all the other times where it was possible. Again, d5 was still a move that could have been considered, but now several lines, moving the knight to other squares is possible too, but I thought that white would actually still have enough to be winning on knight f6, takes f6, win the black queen, and then even enter into c7. I'm not exactly sure if white is just crushing here, but I look at lack of development by the knight here. The rook is coming to the e-file. Seems like white should still have enough, because normally the way you evaluate unbalanced material positions is not just the math, but whose king is weaker, who has the initiative, and here it feels like white probably would have had enough. So that was my line there. Okay, so after queen f4, knight to c5 was played, and bishop to e7 comes in. The gloves are coming off because the black pieces can't get in the game in time to make up for what is clearly an out-of-play queen. So as we make the next few sort of obvious moves here, knight to d3, queen to d6, we see AlphaZero willing to sacrifice even more material. D takes e4 was played. Instead of d takes e4, if black tries to play safe moves to get out of it, there's just no way that's happening at this point. This commonly repeated tactical theme of the knight coming into f6 is still on the table. So black does take on e4, pretty much the best chance. After bishop e4, rook f5 is the only move to save the queen. I guess queen g8, I take the rook first, and then I'll bring the bishop to g6 and win the queen or mate later. So after rook f5, we get bishop h4. Note that g4 is probably, I think, winning for white as well, but black, AlphaZero really being patient here. One of the biggest advantages being, I'll just show you, the issue with g4 is that black can save the day with rook d5, and white's win is not so clear, because you take my queen, I'll take your queen. So you might be thinking, well, what does bishop h4 do that is different? Now on g4, the main thing is that this rook cannot move anywhere due to the fact that the bishop is no longer on e7, so moves like rook d5 are opening up to ideas where the queen will eventually come into f8 very quickly. You can take d5, and then the queen comes into f8, because as we said, the bishop on e7 is no longer in the way. So, after g4 was played in the game, that's actually what happened. Okay, bishop takes, here come the pieces into the 8th rank. And now bishop g3 was played. So, this was the last critical moment where I really didn't understand my initial human perspective. Why did Stockfish play c5, which after queen to d5, taking advantage of the pin, went into an endgame where white was up the exchange, and some good old school technique was going to win the game for the first player. What is white actually threatening here? Why does black have to panic with the move like c5? What did these two juggernauts see deeper that we don't? So I analyzed it out. Instead of c5, let's play a move like a5. Makes sense that eventually I might try to get a position where my rook could get into the game, right? Sacrifice the knight rather than the rook. So after moves like king to g2, another move is played to try to free the position. What I realize is the biggest threat, the biggest thing that's going to keep black tied down is the move bishop to e5. As soon as this move is played, it's only a matter of time before all white's trying to do is put black in zugzwang yet again. Why? Well, the bishop on e5 freezes the queen where she stands. Any move by the queen that isn't a check is going to allow queen takes h6 and mate. So, for example, the queen moves, we get takes and mate. So that little tactical theme over here on the king side was really key. And I said any move beside a check. So what happens on check? Well, the king moves, and now your best move might be to just bring the queen back and prevent the mate again. So instead of that, let's say black continues to try to free up space. made some patient moves with the king, and we realized that it's only a matter of time before black just completely runs out of moves. Nothing like a high-level zugzwang of this manner, right? Where the rook moves, okay, the knight falls. If the knight moves, okay, the rook falls. If the queen moves, likely mate falls. And we see that as the longer Stockfish gets to think, you only see that evaluation bar shooting up further for white. And just really, I thought that was a fun and fascinating line to show the difficulties and the long-term compensation the white has here. Again, AlphaZero is sacrificing pieces like humans would, right? Long-term compensation where black can't get anything, go anywhere, get out, right? It's over. Stockfish played c5, and we get to this endgame. I don't want to paint a picture that the game was just over here. AlphaZero did put on some really good technique to win the rest of this game, so I do want to show you a few more moves, if that's okay with you. Who am I kidding? You're going to stick around or you're not, either way. So after knight f6, I found it interesting that, again, like a good human chess player, AlphaZero recognizes that there's enough material advantage, no reason to go pawn grabbing and let there be any kind of weird counterplay, right? Let's just simplify into the endgame and get this thing done old school style. G4 falls for a7, and speaking of getting this thing done human old school style, after bishop e6, bishop e5, and knight d7, one of the things I found to be so fascinating over the next few moves is that we're going to find a common theme here. White emphasizes proper coordination by the rook and the bishop, the constant threat of king activity, okay, and keeping his opponent from having an active king and proper coordination as his top three things. Not material, not rushing forward. So it's good technique and good lessons for all of us anyway. So again, keeping your opponent off balance, proper coordination, and the threat of king activity being more important than any other smaller amounts of material. And so despite Stockfish reaching kind of an ideal blockade, the bishop guards the knight guards the pawns, it's not so simple how white's going to break through. AlphaZero makes the technique look pretty easy. Here's the first example of it. Totally willing to give up the h5 pawn to make sure that he can emphasize getting the bishop to c7, which forever keeps the knight tied down to b6. Now we're going to see that after some proper coordination by the rook, keeping black's king from getting active, white is eventually going to make threats of bringing his own king into the game. First, he brings the rook to the e-file. Nothing wrong with that, especially because it keeps this king from ever having threats of entering into a more active scenario. Again, if this knight moves, that's when black will have to worry about the shots coming back to the pawn. So black is kind of stuck, and that's what allows the white king to eventually now make the threat of activating itself up the board. After rook e3, we get some nice little tickle here once again, but patient. We're not going to sit here and dive into all the little other candidate moves for white. There were several, but mainly just highlighting the fact that the patient approach from white, really nice to see. And after the move rook e1, by the way, the immediate threat was bishop takes c5, knight takes, followed by rook e5, which is a good point because in this position, it's why black can't just continue to sit tight. You'd like to as black, but white has finally got a position where there is a threat, something like this. Would be a good win on the spot. So the fact that he can't just sit tight means that he has to play the move h4, again, trying to keep white from getting the active king, but that makes the h4 pawn vulnerable, now on the same color square as your bishop, and the technique continues. We're going to see, again, proper coordination by the rook. Once again, not going for trades, not going for crazy lines. Don't play rook takes b5 and allow knight to d4. Play the move rook to d5 and prevent black from ever reaching the ideal squares with the knight, right? This is just good old-fashioned family fun. After bishop e6, rook d6, again, coordination by the bishop is going to help to kind of keep this knight at bay out of these squares, because after the rook moves, knight d4 wouldn't be good due to bishop c3 pinning it. And, of course, d2 is already guarded. And so, again, all these things were emphasized over the rushing forward of anything, and eventually proper rook and bishop coordination combined with the threats of king activity are going to lead black to a position where he really didn't have any choice but to give up the b5 pawn, which once this f5 pawn, the f pawn gets in the job here, which is constantly threatening things like f5 where everything would be undermined, black had to give up the b5 pawn. And again, so I guess I'm going to go for several more moves. If Stockfish played it on, we'll play it on. But it really now at this point, I think officially was an easier matter of technique. Just really doing everything he can to avoid black from ever getting threats. And now that the king side pawns have been eliminated, white begins the journey, the greatest adventure, to come over to the queen side. And when the c pawn falls, we really will call it a day and say that, once again, AlphaZero putting on a show, playing for long-term forms of compensation, giving us things to evaluate that make you think, could I just go play Stockfish and beat it right now? Even though that's really not true. But please stay tuned. Leave a comment. Let us know how you're enjoying this. Do you find instructive value in these computer-on-computer battles? Doing my best to bring it. Please let us know in the comments. Please subscribe and follow our channels right here, right now. Don't go anywhere else. And stay tuned to this series as we bring you the next game and what was our sort of chosen top 5 AlphaZero's battle.